Okay, hey everybody. Hi, and hello to you. Thanks so much for listening in on today's podcast interview. And we've got a pretty cool guest with you today. We're excited to be able to share. And today we'll be talking about some basics related to industrial hygiene. So we have Morgan Bliss. Morgan is an assistant professor in the Safety and Health Management program at Central Washington University. She's an industrial hygienist. And we're excited to have her come in and talk to us in the first of at least two interviews. This time we'll be talking about some basics related to IH, or industrial hygiene. And then she's been nice enough to agree to come back and kind of talk about the next logical step, which is the hierarchy of control. So that'll be a future webinar as well. So with that, you all, hope you all have a fun time. Think you'll learn a lot. And let me welcome and thank Morgan. Hi, Morgan. How are you doing today?
Great. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you. Thanks again for coming on and sharing your information with us. And I wonder if you could just kind of start by telling us who you are, what you do, and what your interest and experience in industrial hygiene is.
Sure thing. So like you said, my name is Morgan Bliss. I'm an assistant professor in the Safety and Health Management program at CWU. That's within the Engineering, Technology, Safety, and Construction department. So it's a big, long name. Prior to joining academia in 2016, I did 10 years as an occupational environmental health and safety consultant, primarily in the Southwest, specializing in healthcare, power plants, things like that. And so from 2006 to 2016, that's what I did. I started as an industrial hygienist right out of college. I answered a newspaper ad that was looking for people with a microbiology or chemistry degree, and I was like, sweet, that'll work. So I did various project and program management roles, worked my way into environmental, worked my way into safety, got my CIH and my CSP, got a master's degree. And then I was like, this is enough. I think I'm going to go teach.
All right. Good intro. And Morgan's been nice enough to create a little PowerPoint with some additional visuals while we talk. So I think, is this probably where you're going to transition to the PowerPoint, Morgan?
You ready?
I am. I think we all are.
Okay, great.
All right, great. I see it. So if you're going to talk to us about industrial hygiene, maybe I could just ask you to start by, for those of us who don't know, explaining what industrial hygiene is, how it's related to safety and health in general, and occupational safety and health in particular.
Sure. So there's usually industrial hygienists where sometimes called the like sciencey, nerdy types of safety. So a lot of them like to give the textbook answer. So I'll give you the textbook answer first, then I'll give you like my actual answer on the next slide. So the textbook answer is the one that the American Industrial Hygiene Association has written, which I summarized up here on the slide, but I'll read it to you real fast. It says, industrial hygiene is a science and an art, so that's cool, devoted to the anticipation, recognition, evaluation, prevention, and control of those environmental factors or stresses arising in or from the workplace, which may cause sickness, impaired health and well-being, or significant discomfort among workers or among citizens of the community. So what's cool about that is it's not just focused on like immediate harm. It's not just focused on the workers. It's focused on the community. It's focused on well-being, comfort. The International Labor Organization, on that second bullet point, says that industrial hygiene is the prevention and control of hazards arising from the work processes. And everywhere else in the world that isn't the United States, they pretty much call it occupational hygiene. So if you're searching for information for industrial hygiene and you're like, why am I only getting US stuff? That's why you have to search occupational hygiene if you want to learn more about occupational hygiene on an international realm. So my interesting answer, if I can make my slide go forward, and all these little cartoons you're seeing are cartoons I've drawn of myself doing industrial hygiene things. So I'd like to make it unique. So my interesting answer is that industrial hygiene is awesome because it's applied problem solving, like every day. Every day is involving all of those 21st century skills that we want to have, that we need in the competitive workplace. So you've got that global awareness component. You've got financial literacy. You know, there's a cost to doing controls. You have health literacy because IH is a very health-based thing. You have environmental literacy. You understand that everything we do has a potential environmental impact. It involves creativity, which I'm keen on. It involves critical thinking and problem solving, lots and lots of communication, information literacy, productivity, adaptability, all of that, responsibility. So industrial hygiene is a really technically demanding, challenging, awesome field that is primarily focused on, according to the American Board of Industrial Hygiene, who certifies certified industrial hygienists, on giving priority to health and safety issues related to the protection of people. So everybody. That's my interesting answer.
All right, that was a great answer in two parts. Thanks for the official answer. Thanks for the Morgan answer. And special thanks for, you are the first interviewee I've ever worked with who provided her own creative artwork. So well done. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so that's what IH is. Maybe you could give us as a follow-up kind of an explanation of what kind of people work in industrial hygiene, what kind of education and specialties do they have?
For sure. So how do you become an industrial hygienist? In my case, I did not follow the traditional route. There's four basic ways. The traditional route is you go to a 4-year undergraduate institution, you go through a program in industrial hygiene or environmental health and safety, and you continue into becoming an industrial hygienist. So you did your degree, you got your job. The second way is the way I did it. You go to a 4-year undergraduate institution with some other science or engineering related field. So I graduated with a degree in microbiology and chemistry. I knew I was really bad at lab work, and my lab partner kindly asked me to not go into lab work. So I was like, what else do you do with this degree? So you get a related field, could be like environmental science, it could be physics, it could be biology or chemistry, safety, engineering fields, and then you continue into becoming an industrial hygienist because it's such an interdisciplinary field that it works with other degrees. The third way that you can do this is to do a 2-year institution with a program in industrial hygiene or related field, and then you continue into becoming an industrial hygiene technician. The trick is you can't sit for the certified industrial hygienist exam if you don't have a 4-year degree. It's not an option. So option 3 is to be a technician level, just do the 2-year program and then continue into being a technician. And if you have an undergraduate degree in Renaissance history or English or psychology or something, and you're like, I really want to get into industrial hygiene, that's fine. You'll probably have to do a graduate program in industrial hygiene or related field before you can become an industrial hygienist, because as you can see on the slides, you have to have 180 academic contact hours or 240 continuing education hours in a certain topics to be able to sit for the certified industrial hygienist exam. It includes things like fundamentals of industrial hygiene, toxicology, control methods, a little bit of environmental, but they won't even let you apply or sit for the exam unless you have these requirements. You also have to have 2 hours of ethics training, which is nice. And in order to sit for the CIH exam, you can't just do this straight out of school. You have to have a certain level of experience. So if you don't have a graduate degree or a industrial hygiene related degree, you have to have 4 more years of experience. If you have a master's degree in IH or a bachelor's degree from a ABET accredited IH program, it's way less requirements for experience. So that's cool. Incentive to go to one of those schools. But how do you do it? You can go about it a whole variety of ways, but those 4 are the most basic. And as far as specialties go, my specialty was healthcare. Still is, I hope. I haven't given up on it now that I'm academic. You can specialize in manufacturing. You can specialize in construction. You can specialize in disaster management. You can specialize in laboratory and research environments. I was a consultant, so you can specialize in consulting. Lots of different ways you can go.
Right, great, good answer. Thanks for spelling that all out. I just 2 points about that. One, I literally just completed an IH course yesterday, and my instructor followed your path as well. Studied biology and chemistry and fell into IH by accident, if you will. And I think that's common. I fell into my career by accident. I'm an English lit major who's in instructional design. The other thing is, as you said, the changing workplace, people are going to constantly have to refresh their skills and possibly even enter new careers. So it's nice to see that while there is, I guess, a official or normal way where you go to college for IH and then practice IH in your career, that there are alternate paths into that, because we're all going to be essentially reinventing ourselves over time. So thank you very much. Okay, so if that's what if we talk about what IH is and who does IH, what does an IH do on a day-to-day basis, especially in an occupational context?
Sure. So it's a very long answer if I was to give you like the complete answer. So what I wanted to do was kind of use a project as an example. And I worked as a environmental health and safety manager, program manager for a healthcare system in Arizona. So I've done the managerial side, I've done the consulting side, but I wanted to come at this from a consultant side because I think a lot of new industrial hygienists or people who have their first interaction with an industrial hygienist will usually deal with a consultant. You need to get something done. You don't have the in-house support to do it, so you sub it out. So you want to know kind of what they're thinking and what their process is. So that's how I'm going to go about answering this. So using a project as an example, let's assume that you are the industrial hygienist for a manufacturing company. What do they make? Doesn't really matter. But you're notified that a couple of your workers have experienced hearing damage, and they want you, they identified it during their annual physical exam, and management wants to know what's up with it. They want to have the noise source evaluated, and they want you as the industrial hygienist to recommend controls. But also, while you're there, this happens all the time. They're like, since you're going to be there anyway, can you do these 8 other things? So while you're there, they want you to check dust levels or particulate levels, because workers have been complaining about persistent coughs. You got 2 things that they told you, like noise and dust. So if I was to anticipate the project, it might go ideally it would go like this. It doesn't always. First, you'd meet with the client. Whoever the client is whoever wants the service from you. So you meet with the management team at the workers at this and workers at the site, and they're going to tell you what they think they need, because that's valuable information. And then you're going to research the site, the complaints, the equipment, the substances used, find out what they want, what's happening at the site. And then ideally, again, we like to do site walkthroughs before. So sometimes industrial hygienists will get some flack on their proposals for like extra time. You don't want the first time we step onto your site to be the first time we've seen your site. There's stuff that we can evaluate from that initial site walkthrough that helps inform our proposal, makes it more accurate, helps us do a better assessment. So ideally, you do an initial site walkthrough, get first impressions, and then you'd write the proposal. Now, I'm not saying if you're doing this in-house that you have to do a proposal per se, but industrial hygiene monitoring, for the most part, costs money. It's either the cost of the consultant, the cost of the equipment, the cost of the sampling, or if you have most of the stuff in-house, then you're just paying for the laboratory analysis, but you still need to have an idea of what that costs. So you write the proposal or the budget, figuring out how long you need to spend on site. Is it going to be multiple days? Is it 1 day? What equipment do you need? Are there lab fees? How fast do they need the laboratory analysis completed? Is it 5 days? Do they need it in 2? All the costs are different. So once you've developed the proposal, then you develop the sampling plan as part of the proposal. In the sampling plan, you're like, how many workers am I going to monitor for noise? Am I doing a full indoor environmental quality assessment, or am I just looking at dust and particulates? Am I doing area sampling? Am I doing worker sampling? Am I doing both? What's the budget with this company? Because sometimes you have to scale back your sampling plan. You give them the Cadillac version, and all they really want is Kia with slightly less fancy. So once you've developed that sampling plan, you submit it and you do the sampling. First you order the equipment. Sorry, I went ahead of myself. So you've got the sampling plan, the client approves it, and they're like, okay, go for it. Then you show up with all the equipment and media that you ordered, making sure you ordered the right stuff. And then you go to the site and you do the monitoring. This usually involves us like watching the workers work, which is really irritating for workers. And they always say stuff like, wish I had your job. And you're like, yeah, I'm going to go back to my hotel and work for like 5 hours after this, after watching you work all day. So maybe. I'm not saying your job isn't terrible. But it's a really weird thing to watch people work, but we have to, because we're making sure that the job hazard analysis that they may or may not have given you is accurate. You're making sure that the tasks they're doing aren't going to compromise the sample in any way. So, and an important note on air sampling, it needs to follow the NIOSH Manual of Analytical Methods or the laboratory requirements. So this has all these adapters and filters, and it looks very sci-fi. It's very cool to do that sampling. And then you submit that to the laboratory. You wait for the results. Once the results are back, you compare them to relevant standards or regulations. You determine if they're above or below as far as the exposure goes, and then you communicate that information in a report. So that's how a normal project goes. And the daily activities can consist of any of those things.
All right, good. Thanks. That was nice, kind of walking us through a case study, if you will. Okay. So in this example, your hazards were noise and then dust or airborne particulates. In addition to that, since you've agreed to come back and talk about controls, we'll kind of table some of that. And maybe you could tell us more about the kind of general types of hazards that are out there in the workplace that workers should be aware of.
Sure thing. I have a lovely slide. The general types of hazards, again, if you specialize, then you'll only be dealing with the things that you specialize in. So I have not specialized per se. I'm a more generalist, but I retrieved this list from this acronym, International Network of Safety and Health Practitioner Organizations, INSHPO. They have a occupational health and safety practitioner and professional capabilities framework that identifies all the hazards that occupational health and safety specialists, including industrial hygienists, need to be aware of. And they split it out in this really nice, organized way. So first it would be biomechanical, like lifting and handling and repetitive strain. If you're more of an ergonomics specialist or a human factor specialist, that's more where you're focusing your efforts. Where we do a lot of efforts is chemicals, so toxics, carcinogenics, corrosives, things like that, sensitizers. I am not an expert in nanoparticles by any means, but you can specialize in nanoparticles. You look at thermal hazards like heat and cold. Those ones are deceptive. You'd think they'd be really simple, but they're not. Noise and vibration, they like to lump them together. I prefer to separate them usually because they're different issues. One thing that industrial hygienists are really heavily involved in is indoor environmental quality or indoor air quality. So the classic things that they'll look at is ventilation, lighting, and mold, water damage, things like that. And that's a real hot topic and has been for at least the last 15 years. And then now we're getting more into psychosocial hazards like the effects of stress and fatigue, assisting with workplace violence planning. One of the ones that's my passion because of my microbiology background is the biological hazards. I find that very interesting, and infectious diseases. That's probably why I kind of specialized in healthcare. And then ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. You can also become a specialist in that. So that's that's not even all of them. It's just the pretty version.
That's a good list. I anticipated most of them. I wasn't anticipating psychosocial, although it makes sense. And I know an example of something that you're really interested in is there was a recent study on safety and health empowerment for women in trades called SHOOT. I did an interview that'll be on a Convergent blog very soon. And that was all dealt with issues related to work stress from being a woman in a masculine workplace. So I hadn't anticipated psychosocial, but it makes total sense as well. Mm-hmm. All right. So obviously one of the big responsibilities of working in IH and being an industrial hygienist is to recognize hazards. We said we'll table this issue of controls for a while. But is it also important for not just the IH to be able to do this, but for employees to be able to recognize these hazards? And if so, do you in particular have tips for how to teach employees how to recognize these hazards?
Sure. One of the big complaints that I hear a lot about both new industrial hygienists and established industrial hygienists is like they're always in their office. And like there's probably a good reason for that. They're probably doing a bunch of research. They're probably very overworked. But how I did it when I worked for that healthcare facility and when I was out as a consultant is you have to like get out of your office and talk to workers. If you don't understand how work is actually being done at your facility, as opposed to how you think it's being done with the procedures and the policies and whatnot, you're not going to be able to recognize hazards, and neither are they. So recognizing hazards is already done as part of safety management. You're looking at, air contaminants, chemical issues, biological issues, physical issues, ergonomic issues. Like they get some decent training in how to identify hazards that way. What industrial hygienists really add is that focus on preventing the exposure in the first place. Like, I don't want to have to mitigate the exposure. I don't want it to ever happen. I want to plan my process well enough ahead of time that we've already identified all the issues. And another thing that I like to, when I would be out wandering around with the workers and figuring out what they're doing, is a lot of the time they'd be focused on just the immediate issue. They're like, this isn't going to hurt me now. Like, it's not going to burn me. It's not going to like melt through my skin. It's not going to irritate my skin. It's not going to get in my eye. Like, I'm fine now. And I was like, but you don't know, because I know you didn't read the safety data sheet. You don't know what it's going to do in the future with all of your chronic use of this chemical. We don't necessarily know what it's going to do because we don't have the toxicological data for that. So focusing on that chronic effects of things and considering them and focusing on synergism, like how two things can interact and create a much more substantial effect. So, and that's usually listed in the safety data sheets, but employees know how to do their job better than I do. So I'm not going to stand there with my clipboard and just evaluate them. I need to help them understand that their work is potentially hazardous, both in the immediate and in the long term. So it's really staying ahead of your projects and staying ahead of any changes that are happening to see if you're going to have synergistic effects or see if you're going to start working with a chemical that's known to have chronic health effects.
Good call. So I like the emphasis on chronic and chronic effects and synergism. And tell me if I'm wrong here. I guess I could boil those down with an example of asbestos. Asbestos is going to create chronic effects from accumulated exposures over time. It's a lot easier for me as a worker to know that I don't want to put my hand on a hot stove, but it's also because it's immediate pain and very obvious. But that chronic problem from asbestos is maybe a little bit easier for me to blow off and not worry about. And then, if I'm correct, asbestos exposure has a synergistic effect, negative effect if I'm a smoker as well. Is that correct? Is that a good example?
Big time, yes. And most of the asbestos workers that I worked with had a very devil-may-care attitude about it. They're like, well, something's going to kill me. And I'm like, does it have to be dying slowly by choking or lung cancer? Like, could it be anything else? And there's different numbers on the whole asbestos smoking thing. Some people say it's like 5 times more likely. Some go as high as 90. I don't know the real number because it keeps changing. But there's lots of other chemicals that have synergistic effects. And again, with the toxicological lack of data, we don't really know. So there could be chemicals that we're working with that we think are safe. They're going to cause long-term issues that we won't know about for another 20 years.
Right. All right. Good point as well. Thank you. Okay. Next question. Is there a kind of a general industrial hygiene process that you can walk us through kind of at a high level?
Sure. So I made a picture. Well, thing. This is not mine. This is the classic industrial hygiene paradigm, but I don't know that industrial hygienists have communicated this out. Usually when people learn about industrial hygiene, if they're safety professionals or environmental people, they learn 3 of these. They learn recognize, evaluate, and control. They learn REC. And if they go to one of the OSHA Training Institute classes, they might learn the anticipate, recognize, evaluate, control, or REC. But a couple years ago, maybe more than a couple, NIOSH and AIHA came up with this revised paradigm. They thought that the confirm element that you see at the end is like assumed, but it wasn't. We need it to be called out in the cycle, and this is a cycle. So your first part of the cycle is anticipate, and then recognize, evaluate, control, and confirm. And how I wanted to explain this is to harken back to our previous example with the manufacturing facility. So when you first got your request as the industrial hygienist for that manufacturing facility to check dust levels, if you were following the anticipation piece of it, you would have already started the industrial hygiene thought process, because under anticipation, hopefully that industrial hygienist, if it was a site-based person, would already be familiar with what's going on at their sites. You'd already have historical data about dust monitoring. You would already have information about improvements to processes. So you have already anticipated that you might have this issue based on your knowledge of the site. For recognition, you would use the data gathered during your walkthrough to develop that sampling plan specific to the dust generating activities of concern at that site, specific to the products that they're using and the substances that they're using. So you are recognizing site-specific data. For evaluation, that's that sampling component. You take those area samples or personal samples to assess the exposure risk to the workers. Under controls, once you've got your samples results back and you've compared them and determined the potential exposure risk, while you were there, you also probably took really extensive notes about what was going on, what processes were happening, review job hazard analysis forms, review historical sampling data, review process hazard analysis forms, like any piece of information you could get your hand on, so that you can effectively recommend controls that aren't already in place or that need to be improved. And then for confirmation, once you've recommended controls, how do you know that they worked? You got to do some more sampling and then compare the new results to the old results to determine the exposure risk after the control methods were implemented.
Great. And how old did you say this particular 5-step cycle here is?
It feels like 2014 maybe, but I'd have to check the internet to be sure.
Ballpark though. So it's looks very PDCA influenced.
Yes, it does.
Influenced. I just had a conversation with Pam Woloski and about safety management, and we're still talking about circles and cycles and PDCA. I'm glad you called out that thing about confirming, and obviously that's important in IH. But you and I are working on other projects, and we've been talking about the importance of, setting up a program or something and then checking the data to confirm and see if it's working, as opposed to just going on your gut sense. So that's important, I guess, in IH in all fields. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you've given us a nice intro to IH, told us about the people who perform it, importance at work, given us a high-level method, and we're going to look at those a little bit more over time. What's new and exciting in the world of IH? What's got all you people with Twitter?
I don't know if industrial hygienists can get a Twitter per se. Anyway, too far. We're good. All right. So hot topics in industrial hygiene. There are so many. I had to smush it down to a reasonable amount. One thing that is of particular interest to lots of manufacturing companies is the increased acceptance of the use of exposure banding or control banding, which basically helps you use toxicological data to develop exposure levels for workers for substances that we don't have exposure limits for yet. Mm. And it allows you to band together similar types and levels of exposures and similar types of workers. It's complicated and yet simple at the same time. A lot of industrial hygienists are still learning it because it's, again, complicated. It came out of the pharmaceutical industry primarily. But NIOSH is working on, and probably has almost completed, a guidance document for businesses and site-based IHs to use in implementing exposure banding at their facilities. So look for that in the near future. Nanoparticles, another big one. They're in everything, everywhere. You can specialize in nanoparticle industrial hygiene, but basically finding ways to sample them effectively, trying to evaluate what the health effects are depending on whether it's a dust or applied with like a suntan lotion and stuff like that. Another big one is opioid exposures. It's primarily focused on protecting first responders and related workers and healthcare workers, trying to sufficiently protect them, how to do a cleanup. And it's kind of similar to when they first released the guidance for cleanup of methamphetamine labs. I anticipate it's going to be similar to that a lot of them require CIH to confirm that the methamphetamine, a covert methamphetamine lab was cleaned up properly. So you have to do some really complex sampling to do so. Mm-hmm. One that I'm super excited about is wearable sensors. Well, super excited and then not at the same time, because, you know, technology is awesome, but we don't seem to know what we're doing with it yet. We're just like seeing all the cool things we can do and not really thinking about what we can do with the data. So integrating your wearable sensors for like a gas detector or particulates or whatever else to give real-time data to the worker and transmit that back via the Internet of Things into your business's general like data collection. But if that information isn't making it to a industrial hygienist or safety professional, or it's not being evaluated, or we don't really know how to evaluate it, and what are we gonna do with all this data that we're generating? We don't have answers for that right now. So that's a real interesting issue. Industrial hygienists are really getting on the big data wagon. Disaster management is another one. The American Industrial Hygiene Association has a specific page associated with disaster management and all the resources that they put together. Because if a hurricane hits or a tornado hits or there's a pipe explosion like what just happened, disaster management, you need industrial hygienists to help assess the risk to workers working at the cleanup site and the community. That's like what we do. And you can specialize in that. Silica exposure is another obvious one since the regulations just changed / existed. Basically, most of the industrial hygienists I've been talking to have been making recommendations for sampling. A lot of the companies are like, I can't afford to hire an IH. We're like, not trying to be difficult, but you can't really afford not to hire an IH, because if you do it wrong, then you have to do it again. And then you're just wasting all your money on sampling. So how do you decide what to sample and where? How do you handle table A? And who can serve as the competent person? That's a lot of the questions that my colleagues have been getting. And then another one that is just going to become more and more of an issue till like 2050-ish, I think is the estimate, when they're going to be like a substantial amount of baby boomers and such. But the aging workforce, and this is an interesting concern because you have to look at both human factors and ergonomic concerns, because when we developed we meaning back in the day in the 1970s, the permissible exposure limits, those were developed based on the idea of the healthy worker effect, that the average American worker is healthier than the average American. If people are staying in the workforce longer because they have to, or because they choose to, I don't know that they're necessarily reflective of that healthy worker that these permissible exposure limits were developed for, and therefore they're not being sufficiently protected, because you have to consider the working conditions. You may need to increase lighting because your eyes get less sensitive to light as you age. The psychosocial factors, like, are people feeling like they're being left out of decisions because they're part of the aging workforce? Are they just seen as like the part that just needs to go retire? Because that's not true. They probably have a ton of institutional knowledge. You have to consider the employee's health. So I had a statistic that I totally forgot to find, but it was that there was a substantial percentage of Americans who have one or more chronic conditions that they're living with, and it's just going to get more and more substantial. And then the professional skills piece of it, where they started work at a time when computers weren't like a thing. So they may have learned how to use it, but learning how to interact in this really always present internet focused society is exhausting. So the aging workforce, I prefer to call it productive aging, and that's how the CDC and NIOSH work on it. They have a website about it, but that's another big concern on how we can keep our workers healthy and safe, like for the duration of their work.
Wow, a lot of good stuff there, including so many good points about the aging workforce. I couldn't remember what I want to call out. That was a lot of good stuff. I can confirm that silica is a big one. I just went through the 3.5-day IH course, sitting next to a guy, a safety manager in construction, and he wanted to call every single point back to silica. So that is definitely an issue. I get your point about the sensors, a lot of excitement, but we're kind of flooded with data and we don't know what to do with it all or how to make sense of it, and nanoparticles. And I look forward to learning more about exposure banding. And for those listening here, whenever Morgan tosses something out, like a document that's being created, I'll get you a link that'll get you that. All right, thanks a lot, Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
So, what did I not ask about that you'd like to tell us about? Anything that we've missed talking about in our introduction to IH?
I have one more slide on cool stuff on industrial hygiene because I'm a nerd. And then my last slide has all the classic industrial hygiene references so they can take a look.
Yeah.
So why I think industrial hygiene is awesome.
Yeah, please nerd on.
I am nerding on. I am. So if you, after this lovely podcasty interview thing, are like, this is some cool stuff, I would like to learn more. If you're a social media fan, you can just use the hashtag #IamIH. The American Industrial Hygiene Association is having all of their members who are social media people, I am not one of those, post their stories and their examples of all the cool stuff they're doing using that hashtag. So you get to see lots of real life, interesting stuff that's happening. There was a lot of hashtag #IamIH happening during the Puerto Rico hurricane recovery. There's probably a lot of hashtag #IamIH stuff happening with that pipe explosion in New York that just happened like yesterday. So if you want to see cool stuff that's happening in IH, use that hashtag. They also have a IH Heroes comic book thing, and I'm a complete nerd, so I totally dug that. Showing the different phases of an industrial hygienist's career using those cartoon characters that are based on real people, but they kind of like sci-fi'd it up. So that's called the IH Heroes campaign.
Is that what we're seeing in a picture here on the right side of the screen?
Correct. It's pretty cool stuff. But why I like it, it's very proactive. It's constantly changing. So we're always trying to stay apprised of those new technologies, new regulations. It can be very challenging to work in because as soon as you feel like you've mastered it, it has changed. And you're like, I just figured that out. That is not fair. But I was going to paraphrase the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists. They have a really great website. And they said basically good occupational hygiene benefits workers and industry alike, because the more healthy the workers are, the more productive they are, the more efficient processes you develop, the more money you save with those technological improvements that industrial hygienists might recommend. So like, we're not here to spend your money willy-nilly. We're trying to make it so that everyone is successful. So that's my favorite part about industrial hygiene, is it's good for business too. And then if you want to learn more, the 5 biggest sites are the American Industrial Hygiene Association. They have their basic website, and then they have a did you know kind of flashy document about like what industrial hygienists do. It talks about where they work, what they're responsible for, what kind of hazards they assess, what kind of equipment, what kind of degrees you need. I covered most of it. And then if you're like, I want to learn more, but I don't want to buy a textbook, that's cool. The International Labor Organization, the ILO, has an encyclopedia of occupational health and safety. It's totally free on the internet. And they have chapter 30 of occupational hygiene. So it gives you all the basics about what is occupational or industrial industrial hygiene in that web encyclopedia. So that's pretty cool. Lots of interesting figures on understanding how substances affect the body and all that. And there's a toxicology element in there that's cool. If you're already an industrial hygienist and you want to get certified, or you want to become an industrial hygienist and in 4 years get certified, the group that does that is the American Board of Industrial Hygiene. And so it tells you what IH is and how you can get certified. If you're on the international side, the International Occupational Hygiene Association has a frequently asked questions website about how IH works in the international realm, because there's tons of industrial hygienists in the US and Canada, and then there's like way less of occupational hygienists, just because it's not known that it needs to be a thing, or it's lumped in with safety professionals. And then if you wanted to see I'm not going to say a ridiculous list, but a very comprehensive list of all the workplace safety and health topics that you might want to consider as hazards or concerns, the CDC NIOSH has this massive alphabetized list of like everything from acrylamide to something with the Z, and they're hyperlinked to information about how you can evaluate and control with those hazards.
Good. And if I could ask one kind of follow-up on that, if somebody looked at all these resources and thought it was great and got super pumped and wanted to go study safety and or IH at the maybe Central Washington University Safety and Health Management Program, where could they find some information about where you work and in your program?
Oh, sure. So if you wanted to, you could go to the Central Washington University website and then search the Engineering, Technology, Safety, and Construction Department. Within that department, the Safety and Health Management Program is a component, and we have a bachelor's in Safety and Health Management, a Bachelor of Science, and we have a Risk Management minor that's brand new and fully online. That's pretty awesome. And then if you're a different degree, you wanted a different degree and you wanted to minor in safety, we also have a minor in safety. And we're working on some other things that I can't talk about yet because they're not approved, but they're very exciting.
I'm sure they are. Okay, well, we look forward to hearing about that as well. Let me thank you, Morgan, for sharing this introduction to IH with me, and I learned some stuff, and with everybody out there. And for everybody out there, keep your eyes open. Morgan will be coming back for a second interview where we talk about the hierarchy of controls. And keep your eye on Morgan in general. And Morgan and I collaborate on a lot of things, so we'll be working on some additional stuff that you'll see at the Convergence Training blog or on LinkedIn. Hopefully it'll be interesting to everybody. And with that, let me say, Morgan, thank you very much. I'm going to hit the stop button here. Everybody out there, thank you for listening in. And Morgan, I'll see you on the other side of the stop here.